Hey everyone, this is your friendly neighborhood Amr from Toronto.
And this is Erin.
And welcome to a new episode of your favorite podcast, Das Criminal.
Hi guys, welcome back, or welcome if you're joining us for the first time.
Yeah, we always welcome new listeners. We're kind of like a pyramid scheme like that.
We've got kind of a part 2 for you today from last week, so do you want to just jump right into it?
Yeah, sure. Why not? Let's do this.
In 1953, the CIA engineered the overthrow of Iran's popular Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh and propped up instead the country's detested monarch, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. Exploiting Iran's oil fields, the Shah enriched himself while the country's workers struggled, and his security forces ruthlessly persecuted dissidents who protested the regime. By the late 1970s, the Shah's cruelty toward the Iranian people would finally blow up in his face as the country revolted in a series of strikes and protests. One of the Shah's harshest critics, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, would emerge as a leading figure in Iran's revolution and the Islamic Republic that would follow. As for the Shah, he looked for sanctuary in his old ally, the United States. But President Jimmy Carter's reception of the tyrant inflamed tensions in Tehran, and a group of students responded by seizing the U.S. Embassy and holding 52 of its diplomats hostage. Today, we bring you the story of Iran's 1979 revolution and the events now known as the hostage crisis.
We're pretty much picking up where we left off last week's episode on the 1953 coup against Mossadegh. While it's not absolutely necessary to listen to that episode to understand this one, we would highly recommend it as it puts many of these events into context.
You can totally understand this one without listening to that one, but it really does help. After Mohammad Reza Shah reclaimed his throne in 1953, thanks in large part to the meddling of the CIA, he began a cutthroat consolidation of his dictatorship. His first maneuvers included undoing Mossadegh's oil nationalization plan and granting a 50% share to foreign powers, restoring diplomatic relationships with the UK and strengthening Western alliances, crushing groups that had opposed him, including dismantling the National Front and imprisoning its leaders like Mossadegh.
As well as executing various National Front hardliners, including one of the most radical sort of anti-monarchists and a former ally of Mohammad Mosaddegh, the former foreign minister Hassan Fatemi.
The Shah also squashed Tuda, the main leftist party in the country, and he established an internal security service called SAVAK. SAVAK received assistance from the United States and Israel, and it implemented large-scale surveillance operations to round up political dissidents. It filled prisons with those who questioned or rebelled against the regime, and it was known for brutal policies, including forced disappearances, torture, and executions. The Shah also installed a two-party system in the Majlis, or National Assembly, with both parties loyal to him. Iranians sarcastically called these the Yes Party and the Yes Sir Party.
You have to give credit. Very, very.
No, that's funny. That's like
I do appreciate the irony. Yeah, man, that's grim. You know, when you're faced with something like repression, humor tends to blossom.
Yeah, sarcasm for sure.
Yeah. Well, in the early 1960s, Iran faced an economic downturn, and people again began protesting at great risk to their own safety due to the Shah's oppressive policies. The Shah decided to announce an assortment of protocols and reforms termed the White Revolution, a phrase which would imply revolution without bloodshed, but also an allusion to Russia's anti-Bolshevik White Army, thus showing the Shah's commitment to anti-communism.
He instituted a land reform program. He nationalized lands held by large landlords and religious clergy and redistributed it to the peasants. On the surface, this seems like a constructive policy, but the peasants were not supported by any loans or training, and many of the plots given to them were too small to even support their own families through subsistence farming. Many of these farmers returned to the paid rural labor force or migrated to urban centers where poverty and unemployment were growing. Seizing lands from the clergy also had the effect of alienating the religious leaders from the Shah.
I'd like to point out here that without proper training, equipment, and land that is sizable enough to sustain a family, peasants were practically forced to either sell their lands back to the landlords and worked as indentured serfs, or to move to cities like Erin just said. For a largely agricultural country like Iran in the 60s, this flux of urban immigration was a recipe for disaster. Interestingly enough, a similar pattern played a role in destabilizing Syria today. In the mid 2000s, a series of devastating droughts forced rural Syrians to migrate to urban centers like Homs, Hama, and Aleppo looking for work. This resulting unemployment and wage deflation led to the political instability that was one cause among several for the current war.
Yeah, some scholars, I know one named Stephen King, not the horror novelist Stephen King, totally different guy, refers to this as retraditionalization. So basically, some reforms that are not really well thought out, or perhaps they are well thought out, but they're not having a good consequence for the poor people, they actually force a society to go back to more traditional serfdom.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes total sense. Because if you can't feed your family on your own land, your only options are to basically become a serf again.
Right. The Shah also instituted improvements to education, literacy, and healthcare, and he enhanced the status of women, including family protection laws.
I do want to note here that while the status of women on paper was improved, the only women who saw material gains in Iran at the time were upper class women. So often you'll see pictures of Iranian women in bikinis, and they're used by both liberals and neocons to justify military aggression against the current Islamic Republic. But the Shah's liberation of women de facto did not extend beyond a very exclusive class of elites. The vast majority of women in rural areas, the peasants and the working class, did not experience the Shah's reform on a material basis.
Right. It's a very liberal feminist way of looking at it, of just seeing a picture of, women in 60s dresses or poodle skirts or whatever and thinking like, wow, they've got it so good.
Yeah, you see, it's the same with Afghanistan. You'll see pictures of women in skirts in Afghanistan, and you're like, used to be so good. We should reinstate a dictatorship to get to to do feminism basically. And there's no class analysis. There's no deeper understanding of the society that they're looking at.
Yeah, it's a little bit different than Iran, but you see it in places like Lebanon too, where people will say, before the Lebanese war, women used to wear bikinis. Like, I still wore a bikini in Beirut and stuff all the time. I wore a bikini in South Lebanon. No one stopped me.
Yeah, it's just, and also it's just so superficial to reduce the issue of women's liberation to whether they can wear bikinis or not. Like, I'm pretty sure most women in most countries would first and foremost, their priority is to get food, to get work, to get access to social services like healthcare.
Right. It's quite literally just boiling it down to aesthetics.
Yeah.
The major problem with the regime's modernization plan was that all of these reforms were done in service of the Shah himself. He used the country's petroleum revenues to buy these piecemeal reforms while also spending a ridiculous amount of Iran's income on U.S. military equipment and encouraging foreign investment that undercut small Iranian business people. Perhaps the term white revolution does fit in that the policies were also part of an effort to whitewash the Shah's exploitation of Iranian natural resources and oppressive strategy of governance. But the people of Iran saw right through this, and they weren't happy with the Shah using this mask of liberal modernization to cover up his abuse and profiteering. One specific member of Iran's religious establishment, a high-ranking Shia cleric, or Ayatollah by the name of Ruhollah Khomeini, was among those opposed to the Shah's regime and its American ally. Khomeini was a religious scholar and, up until this point, relatively unknown to most Iranians. He denounced the Shah for his corruption, disregard of the oppressed masses, and selling out of Iran's sovereignty, including the Shah's economic concessions to the United States and close ties with Israel.
Though Khomeini was initially an unknown figure, he became the preeminent leader of the clerical opposition to the Shah in 1962, following the deaths of both Ayatollah Hussein Borjurudi and Ayatollah Abul Qasim Kashani, of the notoriety of last episode. Further, he achieved the position of Marja' al-Taqlid in 1963 after the death of the former Ayatollah Borjurdi. For our non-Shia listeners, a Marja' al-Taqlid, or a Marja' for short, is the highest position a cleric can achieve, translating to a source of emulation. A marja can issue very important religious decisions that lower-level clerics and the masses that coalesce around a given marja are expected to follow. By the late 60s, Khomeini, as a marja, had acquired a large following of hundreds of thousands of Shia in Iran, who saw him as a supreme religious authority.
Naturally, the Shah saw this as a threat. So the Shah's security forces arrested Khomeini in June of 1963, which provoked large demonstrations led by his students and lower and middle-class supporters. The security forces responded by attacking the protesters, killing hundreds and injuring thousands. This, of course, only made tensions in the country worse. Khomeini was released, but he immediately began speaking out against the Shah again, this time specifically criticizing the Status of Forces Agreement, which allowed U.S. soldiers in Iran who committed crimes to be prosecuted in American military court rather than Iranian court. For this, he was arrested again, and this time exiled from the country. First, he went to Turkey in 1964, but was deported to Iraq a year later. He was forced to leave Iraq in 1978, and he went to France.
Interestingly, Khomeini was forced out of Iraq by none other than Saddam Hussein, who at the time was attempting to consolidate his power and did not trust the cleric, who declared that all temporal non-Islamic governments were fundamentally illegitimate and urged people to revolt against them.
Yeah, that obviously would not have gone well for his regime.
Yeah, at all. Oh, and Saddam was actually close to the Shah too, so there was that.
Yeah. The Shah then tightened his grip on the country even more, instrumentalizing the Savak to eliminate any political dissent.
Including, by the way, assassinating Khomeini's own son, Mustafa.
The Shah built up Iran's military and internal security forces, spending the country's oil revenues on high-tech military equipment and luxuries for military officers, effectively buying their loyalty to the regime. Now, we want to debunk a very common misconception about the Iranian Revolution. Some commentators will depict the conflict between the Shah and his critics as a clash over religion, the secular, modernizing Shah versus the backward Islamists. This is a misrepresentation of what the Iranian people's concerns actually were. While many Iranian people, especially the clergy, disliked the Shah's top-down approach to religious reform in the country, the main complaints about life under his regime had to do with the systemic exploitation of the country's resources, the decadence of the monarchy while Iranian workers struggled, and the brutality of the Savak. Furthermore, while some of the underground opposition to the Shah had religious currents, much of it did not. Secular resistance groups at this time included Fedayeen al-Khalq, the Organization of Iranian People's Fedai Guerrillas, a Marxist-Leninist organization, the Organization of Communist Revolutionaries, a Maoist organization, the Tudeh Party, though they were severely weakened by the Shah's persecution, the National Front, Mossadegh's old coalition, which was also shrinking from Shah's persecution, and some nationalist groups within Iran, like the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, which allied with Tudeh at that time. Additionally, some anti-Shah parties with Islamist overtones still embrace many left-wing ideologies. The best-known example of these is Mujahideen al-Khalq, or the People's Warriors, which adopted an Islamic leftist philosophy. Another group, the Liberation or Freedom Movement of Iran, was an offshoot of the National Front, which espoused a form of modernist Islamist liberalism.
I do want to jump in here and point out that while the Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK, started off with a nominal Islamist leftist ideology, it's rapidly devolved into a cult around its founding figure, Masoud Rajavi, and later his second wife, Maryam Rajavi. MEK was exiled from Iran following the revolution and found refuge in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Masoud has not been seen in public for many years, and the common belief is that he is dead, and his wife Maryam is the current de facto leader of this rather strange cult that is heavily favored by the likes of John Bolton and Newt Gingrich as a sort of government in waiting for a regime change operation.
I'm sorry, but the way neocons look at Middle Eastern politics, it just blows my mind.
They're idiots. I mean, liberals are idiots. Neocons are more opportunist than idiots. They're vultures, pretty much. They're picking at corpses. But it's funny because the Atlantic Council and those kind of people are basically backing this cult, the MEK, even though the MEK has fundamentally zero support in Iran. Like, just genuinely zero support. It's a cult. It's a cult around Maryam Rajavi, and there's no support among the Iranian population for this cult.
Yeah. I also so Arabic and Farsi are actually quite different, but for some reason I keep reading this as Mujahideen al-Khawq, which would mean like the peach jihadist, like peach the fruit. I can't get it out of my head.
Yeah, khalq in Farsi means people.
Yes, so we're talking about people, not peach.
So I would join a jihadi organization that fights for peaches.
Yeah, I mean, the peach has now taken on new connotations in the post emoji world.
Oh yeah, that's why I would definitely fight for the peach.
Now, we could debate the compatibility between Marxism and religion until the cows come home, but whatever our philosophies on the matter might be, it doesn't change that many Iranians in the opposition camp at that time were driven by the asymmetrical material conditions sired by the Shah's regime, and that the blueprints of political Islamism hatched by figures like Khomeini were influential in the anti-dynasty uprisings.
From his place of refuge in the Shia holy city of Najaf in Iraq, Khomeini would record anti-Shah homilies on audio cassettes, which his followers would copy and distribute among the mosques and bazaars of Iran. Though Savak tried its best to monitor these activities, even their sophisticated weapons and technology couldn't really track this very old-school system of simple cassette tapes.
Actually, whistleblower Chelsea Manning smuggled intel out of a secure facility for WikiLeaks on a CD she had labeled Lady Gaga. If I had to guess, I'd say that Khomeini's supporters might have done something similar, like, "No, sir, this is my Fleetwood Mac tape. I just really love the enchanting vocals of Stevie Nicks."
No, this
It
is
works,
Elvis
though.
Presley. This is Sinatra, you know?
Right. So by the late 1970s, popular unrest in Iran was growing, and several factors had contributed to the people's discontent with the Shah's regime. To review, the Iranian people were upset by a lack of political freedom and repression of political dissent, high inequality despite huge increases in oil revenues, the Shah's cozy relationship with the United States, especially buying large quantities of American weapons, dealing with US corporations rather than Iranian ones, and bringing lots of American workers to the country when Iranians struggled to find employment. The Shah also maintained close ties with Israel, which many saw as an outpost of Western imperialism in the Middle East. The regime promoted Western values and encouraged the proliferation of a modern elite, while basically shitting on Persian traditions. And there was significant corruption in the government. The Pahlavi family rooted millions from Iran's coffers for their own luxurious lifestyle. Crucially, by this point, the Shah had alienated his administration from pretty much every sector of Iranian society. The working class felt disaffected by the failed land reforms and inequality in the country. The students and urban middle class felt persecuted due to the actions of the Savak and authoritarian nature of the regime. The Shah also pissed off the clergy when he seized a portion of their land and pushed secular modernization from the top down. Basically, the only people loyal to the Shah were those he had bought off, the military higher-ups and the internal security forces.
The Shah also continued his father's policy of distancing Iran from its Muslim past and adopting many pre-Islamic trappings, primarily of the Sassanid and Achaemenid empires. This, of course, deeply infuriated the religiously conservative Iranian peasantry and working class, who held great pride in their Islamic and Shia identity.
By 1977, human rights organizations like Amnesty International were criticizing the Shah's abuse of dissidents and prisoners. The inauguration of the US President Jimmy Carter in 1977 spelled another possible problem, as Carter named Iran as a country that should improve its human rights record. That same year, however, Washington sold a number of F-16s and AWACS planes to the Shah. Still, Iranian dissidents seized the opportunity to publicize the violations by the Shah. They organized into professional associations and student organizations, producing materials on the human rights abuses of the Shah. Groups like Today, the old Communist Party at the time of Mosaddegh, tried to resurrect their organization, but they were hindered by the regime's decades-long persecution.
Instead, the two most important anti-Shah campaigns were the Liberation Movement and a militant wing of the Ulama, the Islamic scholars in Iran. The most influential philosopher of the liberation movement, Ali Shariati, advocated a novel combination of Marxism, Shi'ism, Iranian nationalism, and anti-colonial revolutionary principles. And here I would like to recommend his book, Red Shi'ism, Black Shi'ism. It is really good. Shariati himself died under mysterious circumstances in London in 1977. Many of his supporters have contributed this to the work of Savak and consider him a martyr. Meanwhile, a branch of Islamists, led by the likes of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, insisted on a complete overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of an Islamic state under the governance of the ulama.
In some ways, these factions overlapped. They were both certainly opposed to the policies of the Shah, but some elements within the liberation movement did not support a total overthrow of the monarchy and replacement with a government of Islamic jurists. On his side, however, Khomeini had established a history of criticizing the Shah, which led to his exile. He had the receipts for that, and a form of religious activism that spoke to Iranians across classes and generations.
Now, I don't want to fall into the trap of cultural essentialism here, but Ayatollah Khomeini comes from a long line of Shia theology that stems from Imam Hussein's death at Karbala in the 7th century AD. Since then, Shia political thought has been built around the idea that it is the religious duty of the dispossessed and the oppressed to fight oppression wherever it may be. Further, Ayatollah Khomeini has posited his theory on the guardianship of the jurist, what he called the Wilayat al-Faqih, while in exile, which dictates that all governments following the death of Imam Hussein are fundamentally illegitimate, and that the governments must be comprised of Islamic clerics which act as representatives until the return of the hidden 12th Imam, the Imam al-Mahdi, who went into occultation sometime in the 10th century or 11th century AD, I believe. This idea found large appeal among the discontented and dispossessed working class and peasants in the Shah's Iran.
During all of this, the Shah had been diagnosed with lymphatic cancer, but didn't yet share this news with the public. Perhaps this caused him to consider his legacy and consider what actions he might take to secure the peacock throne for his son, though it's really difficult to say what he was thinking. A crucial moment came on January 7th, 1978, when the state-run Etela'at newspaper ran a defamatory story about Ayatollah Khomeini, who was at that point exiled in Iraq. It actually took me a good while to find out what the article actually said. Most texts just describe it as a disparaging or scandalous article, but they don't say what was so incendiary about it. For some reason, I really expected the article to accuse Khomeini of having a secret child or something, but actually it suggested that Khomeini was a British agent and an ally of the communists, and it questioned his Islamic scholarly credentials and Iranian background.
Man, for something that's so scandalous, they could have done a lot worse. They really could have really hammered home a sort of affair or something.
Yeah, they should have formed a better conspiracy there.
Yeah. Khomeini's colleagues and their students in the Shia's holy city of Qom were nevertheless outraged, and they organized a demonstration in defense of the Ayatollah. Police opened fire on the protesters, killing 7. This turns some of the last holdouts of the clergy who hadn't shunned the monarchy to call for the removal of the Pahlavis.
Traditionally, Shia Muslims hold 2 memorial services for people who have died, one at the burial and the second 40 days later. Iran's religious establishment encouraged mourners to gather 40 days after the deaths in Qom on February 18, 1978. This time, demonstrators, most notably in the city of Tabriz, defaced government buildings, theaters, bars, liquor stores, venues they considered symbols of the Shah's top-down policy of westernization.
I do also want to point out here that funerals are actually a very powerful point of mobilization for the masses in many parts of the world. We see this from Palestine to Bahrain, where funeral marches often act as vehicles for political rallies and dissent. Many repressive regimes actually know this, and in Bahrain, for example, the government banned funeral processions during the revolution in 2011, and further inflamed tensions when they decided to execute prisoners and bury them anonymously to avoid the use of their funerals as rallying points.
Gosh, that's just so horrible.
Yeah, it's very surprising coming into the West where funerals are these like quiet affairs as opposed to like these very politically charged affairs elsewhere.
I wouldn't say they're quiet affairs in my family. Like, we always go to the bar.
Oh no, I want my funeral to be an Irish wake.
It's up on our Instagram, but at my Uncle Tom's wake, my great uncle, for some reason, my family decided to include on the photo board a photo of him and OJ Simpson.
I really hope he died before the O.J. Simpson trial.
Oh no, this was like 2 years ago.
Maybe they were proud he got off in court. They're like, yeah, we're friends with a guy who got off in court.
He was also, he had a picture shaking hands with Jerry Adams.
Jerry Adams, the hero's hero, if you will.
Yeah, I don't know which of my family members put that photo board together and why they were like, oh, definitely put the OJ picture in. But me and my brother were just cracking up. So moving back to Iran, once again, the police forces reacted with deadly fire. And once again, a new wave of protesters gathered 40 days later. This set off a cycle of demonstrations in Iran, and the Shah's responses, oscillating between vicious crackdowns and yielding to some demands, did him few favors. Rather than take a firm position, the palace teetered in its actions, thereby unintentionally encouraging the opposition to keep pushing. The regime also decided to slow the country's economy, which ended up inciting more demonstrations. The tension reached a critical mass on August 19th, 1978, when someone set fire to the Rex cinema in the oil-producing city of Abadan. Almost 500 people were killed, and during the holy month of Ramadan, no less. The regime blamed the religious opposition, as protesters had set fires to theaters during previous demonstrations. The opposition, in turn, called the arson attack a Reichstag fire, a false flag operation carried out by Savak to vilify the protesters.
Well, spoilers alert. I'm going to go back to the episode last week, the part one of this. It is understandable for the opposition to claim that the fire is a false flag attack. We have seen the CIA use false flag riots in which protesters were paid in cash to loot and vandalize the city of Tehran under the name of Mohammad Mosaddegh, delegitimize his government.
Yeah, and as far as I've been able to find, I don't think it's ever been truly solved who set fire to the Rex cinema. Like, it's still a mystery to this day, and many people will tell you it was Savak. Other people will tell you that it was protesters. I don't think anyone truly knows. I mean, the people who did it, they know, but they're not going to confess to it.
Well, unless they have a pang of guilt before they die or something.
Yeah. The anti-Shah rallies continued, and despite the rising death toll for the protesters, they wouldn't give up. The regime declared martial law, but it was too late. Even the Shah's flimsy concessions weren't working. In October, Khomeini was forced to leave Iraq for Paris, but he continued to preach and disseminate his sermons encouraging the overthrow of the monarchy. Finally, the military began to disintegrate, a sure omen of a crumbling dictatorship. The Shah managed to convince Shapur Bakhtiar, a National Front holdover from the Mossadegh era, to assume the prime ministership and lead a civil government. Bakhtiar took office on December 27, 1978, and immediately dissolved the Savak, appointed secular nationalists to his cabinet, released political prisoners, and promised free elections.
Bakhtiar would soon be scrapped by the Islamists. Despite his efforts to immediately change the tide, his appointment by the Shah made him look like a stooge. Moreover, the growing religious opposition movement would no longer settle for moderate reforms.
As for the Shah, he fled Iran with his family, as many as their embezzled assets as they could take, and the rotting remains of Mohammad Reza Shah's father, which he had dug up the night before. On January 16, 1979, about a year after the Qom protests, the second and final Pahlavi monarch flew to Egypt, never to step foot on Iranian soil again. Protesters were absolutely jubilant at the departure of their cruel overlord. Headlines declared, "Shah Raft, the Shah has left." Shortly after, on February 1st, 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran. He was welcomed by a triumphant crowd at the airport.
Khomeini declared Bakhtiar's government illegitimate and appointed liberation movement leader Mehdi Bazargan as a new head of transitional government. Bakhtiar tried to resist, but huge demonstrations and strikes continued, now with guerrillas attacking military bases and seizing weapons.
On February 11th, military commanders announced they would no longer defend Bakhtiar's administration, once again spelling the demise of the sitting government. Bakhtiar himself went into hiding. In 1991, he and his secretary were assassinated in Paris, allegedly by 3 Iranian men. Only one of them was apprehended and served 16 years in a French prison before returning to Iran. In many ways, the protesters had jumped the biggest hurdle of the revolution. They had overthrown the Shah. But it's not as if Khomeini, or anyone really, had an entire government sitting and waiting. Furthermore, due largely to the history of imperial meddling in the country, Iranians rejected the help of foreign powers like the United States, sensing their interests as disingenuous.
And rightly so, to be honest.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Once again, however, a schism arose between the moderate reformers like Bazargan and the hardline religious establishment like Khomeini. Perhaps Bazargan and his cabinet, full of Western-educated, relatively secular constitutionalists, thought they could manipulate Khomeini's supporters into getting behind them. That was a mistake. Khomeini has appointed the nerd Bazargan in the first place, and he was still the one in charge.
Yeah, it seems like perhaps Bazargan thought he could turn the Islamists into puppets, but he was the puppet all along.
Yeah, Khomeini is a lot more cunning than people give him credit for.
No puppet, you're the puppet. Khomeini's camp created revolutionary committees and institutions, which often served as a parallel government to the Bazargan administration. For example, these revolutionary circuits tracked down members of the old regime and held them before revolutionary courts before executing them, much to the chagrin of Bazargan. In May, Islamists established the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which competed more directly with the Iranian military. It's kind of difficult to summarize what leftists were up to at that point. The working class had been instrumental in the downfall of the Shah, especially through the general strikes. But it still didn't have the organizational strength of the religious establishment or a leading figure as notorious as Khomeini. Often, the leftists supported the Islamic revolutionary efforts in getting rid of the Shah's old bureaucratic structures, but they wouldn't gain the institutional positions of the Islamists. Tudeh, for instance, would be banned in the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Here also, the nationalists and leftists within Tudeh, primarily at this point a bourgeoisie intelligentsia, miscalculated and assumed that they could control Khomeini and subsume him into their fold. This was a grave mistake, as we just discussed, as it severely underestimated the influence and political acumen of Khomeini and the clerical opposition.
Again, we can debate the meaning and merits of a socialist Islamic philosophy all day long. I actually think that the vagueness in that term is one of the factors that sort of obscured the ideological differences between doctrinal Marxists and Islamists at that time. Also, for what it's worth, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, which neighbored Iran, created after the Tsar Revolution in 1978, was secular, and even adopted some policies of state atheism until 1987, when it turned more toward Islam. And the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, which was established in 1967 and lasted until 1990, was also a secular state. But neither of those governments are still around, and the Islamic Republic of Iran is still kicking, so take that as you will.
Khomeini 1, Yemen and Afghanistan 0. Well, in March of 1979, Iran held a referendum as to whether the country should become an Islamic republic, with 98% voting in favor. Bazargan and his moderate pals drafted a constitution that might loosely be described as setting the stage for a social democratic republic with an Islamic flavor. This document was reworked by the more hardline Islamists to include the concepts of wilayat al-faqih, or rule of the Islamic jurist, basically setting up a system in which an Islamic scholar, the supreme leader, would hold significant governmental power and oversight.
I feel generally any sort of election or referendum about something meaningful that pulls a 98% should be viewed with some skepticism. Not necessarily saying that it's, rigged or something like that, but in a lot of referenda like these, people opposed will sit out.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It's like, okay, 98% approve, but what's the turnout rate? If it's 98% of like 20% turnout, then it's not really majority, is it?
The turnout in this case was pretty high.
Okay, fair enough.
But just generally speaking, when you see an election result that's very, very, very high, just be a little bit skeptical.
Yeah, I mean, you see it all over. It's easier for people to turn out to vote for something than against something.
Yeah, that's true as well. This leads us up to what Americans frequently call the Iran hostage crisis. There are several myths about this whole situation that persist among Americans. Chief among these is that the hostage crisis was as much a pivotal event in Iranian political history as it was in American political history. By November of 1979, the Iranian Revolution was already well on its way. The Shah had left, the new constitution had been drafted, and the Islamic Republic was already being solidified. Unlike the substantial issue the hostage crisis represented for the Carter administration in the United States, for Iranians it was just one chapter in a much greater period of political change.
The second misconception, taking the embassy workers hostage, was part of some well-orchestrated plot by Khomeini or the Revolutionary Guards or something. There's no evidence that the Iranian government had any prior knowledge or any hand in seizing the embassy. In fact, it's far more likely that the hostage-taking was way more spontaneous than it was premeditated.
So what really happened in 1979? Students began occupying the US Embassy in January, a few days after the fall of the monarchy. They believed that the embassy was a, quote, nest of spies, plotting to once again overthrow the Iranian government and reinstate the Shah as the Americans had done in 1953. The students even took the ambassador and several other diplomats hostage, but were convinced by Khomeini to let them go. Still, the students camped near the embassy, and armed revolutionary committees set up armed checkpoints through which the American workers had to enter.
I mean, to be fair to the students, when the coup happened in 1953, Kermit Roosevelt organized the entire coup from the basement of the embassy. So I don't blame them for being suspicious of that building.
Oh, they had a totally good point.
Yeah. Also, just as a tangential fun fact, just for our listeners to know, after the Islamic Revolution, Iran renamed the street on which the British embassy was on from the Winston Churchill Road, I believe, to the Bobby Sands Road. So that kudos to Khomeini for that.
I believe that was later after Bobby Sands actually died in prison in hunger strike. But as a result, the UK embassy had to basically change where its entrance was to get the entrance off Bobby Sands Street because all of the letterheads and things like that would have had Bobby Sands in them.
That's such an alpha move from Iran. That is so good. So fucking hilarious. I'm pretty sure
Iran
that
does stuff that's funny. Like
they're so petty, but it's so good. Like, I'm pretty sure Thatcher had an aneurysm when she saw that. Anyways, back to Iran. In October of 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi came public with his secret. He had been battling cancer. Pahlavi asked President Jimmy Carter of the United States, his old political ally, would admit him into the country so he could receive treatment. Carter was hesitant but decided to receive the old Shah. The student protesters were enraged, and on November 1st, large demonstrations broke out around the US Embassy to object to the United States' acceptance of Pahlavi. At first, Iranian police protected the compound, but on November 4th, students stormed the embassy again and police stepped aside.
Again, it seems unlikely that the siege of the embassy had been coordinated by the Iranian government or the parallel Islamic organizations. Actually, the students made no effort to justify their actions through Islam. For them, this was all about politics. The United States had long supported the Shah and his oppression of the Iranian people. Once the hostages had been taken, however, and the students discovered documents in the embassy suggesting that the United States had maintained contacts with moderate Iranian politicians, Ayatollah Khomeini praised the ambush of the compound, realizing that the new Islamic Republic of Iran actually had some chips with which they could now bargain. The student militants actually released 8 Black Americans and 5 women as an act of solidarity with oppressed minorities. The remaining 52 hostages would be held for 444 days. The Shah actually completed his treatment and left the United States in December of 1979. The Carter administration asked that Iran release the hostages because Pahlavi had left, but the student militants demanded the Shah and his financial assets be returned to Iran.
The Shah would, of course, die in Cairo in 1980. See our Anwar Sadat episode for a brief overlook on the Egypt-Iran relationship.
In April of 1980, Carter decided to authorize a military rescue of the hostages, which ended disastrously for the Americans. Operation Eagle Claw, conducted by the U.S. Army Delta Force, was totally bungled. 8 helicopters were sent to the first staging area, but 3 of these were busted before the mission really even started. Jimmy Carter decided to abort the mission since the aircraft were damaged. As they were trying to leave, one of the helicopters hit a transport filled with fuel that exploded and killed 8 servicemen. Had the helicopters actually flown to Tehran, there's no telling how well the operation might have gone. It's possible the hostages could have been killed because honestly, it doesn't seem like the US military sent their shining stars for this one.
I don't believe the US military has any shining stars, to be honest with you, at this rate. And in any case, if we look at this from the perspective of Khomeini's supporters, the US military's failure was an act of God. He was watching over the revolution. Just as large groups of mostly unarmed protesters have been able to overthrow the Shah, now a country in the unstable period of forming a new government could actually stand its own against the US military superpower. The hostage crisis forced some moderate Iranian politicians, like Bazargan, to resign, thereby strengthening the Islamist faction of the new government.
The hostages were released on January 20th, 1981, the day of Ronald Reagan's inauguration. Jimmy Carter cited his administration's failure to secure the hostages' release before the election as a primary reason that he couldn't secure a second term. On this podcast, we try to avoid spurious what-ifs whenever possible, and it's not really reasonable to say that had Carter negotiated the hostages' release, he would have won the 1980 election. There were a lot of other factors that went into that loss: inflation, unemployment, and the aesthetic gulch between Mr. Sunday School and a B-movie Hollywoodite.
I do want to point out here that there is ample evidence to suggest that the Islamic Republic was willing to release the hostages much earlier. But Ronald Reagan's election campaign secretly communicated with Iran to keep the hostages, basically to make President Carter look bad, in exchange for more favorable terms should Reagan win. This ultimately led to the Iran-Contra affair, with Iran being armed by Reagan secretly during the Iran-Iraq War through Israel. It's also not the first time a presidential candidate meddled with a sitting government's foreign policy. Most famously, Nixon and Kissinger actively sabotaged President Johnson's peace talks with the North Vietnamese army in order to win the election in 1968, which they succeeded.
Yeah, it does seem, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but it seems like during a lot of this, Jimmy Carter kind of got shafted.
I mean, he did, but he's also an idiot. Like, he shouldn't trust... First of all, he shouldn't have trusted Reagan at all. Secondly, Carter strikes me as a very naive person in many ways. I don't know.
Apparently, I read in one of the sources that when he was called and told the Shah was asking to come to the United States, he slammed the phone down, hanging up, and said, "Fuck the Shah." Like, he really didn't want to take him, but he was pressured by none other than Henry Kissinger.
Mr. President, I think, you should take the Shah in for cancer treatment because it is the real politique power. I can imagine him mumbling something like that.
Apparently as well, the Shah could have gone to Switzerland to receive treatment, but he really wanted to come to the United States. Maybe he said the treatment was better or something, but I kind of interpret that as him giving a final fuck you to the Iranian protesters.
I mean, I could see the Shah's motives in this, but Jimmy Carter was really stupid to let him in. Like, he should have just rejected him. It would have been much easier.
Yeah, it obviously turned into a very bad political decision to take him in.
Yeah.
But moving our attention back toward Iran, by this point, the Islamic Republic was in full throttle. Within the span of about a year, Iran had gone from the US's Middle Eastern puppet state to its nemesis. There is so much in the next few years we could do whole-ass episodes about. There's the Iran-Iraq War, there's the Iran-Contra affair, as Amr mentioned, there's the US downing of Iran Air Flight 655, There's Iranian sponsorship of other groups in the region like Hezbollah. So we're definitely going to come back to Iran at some point in the future.
Yeah, it's a content mine for sure. For now, we hope you've enjoyed this little two-parter we've done. And shout out to our patron Fatma for requesting this. I am wearing the cloak you got me, the Ayatollah cloak. So I'm very much in the role right now. Please do give us your feedback. Do you like having consecutive episodes that are related to one another? Do you like a series, or do you like it more than when we bounce around? Let us know what type of content you want to hear. You can reach us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/dascriminal.
This is the first week of the month, which means that coming out this Wednesday, we have a Patreon bonus episode. And this one is going to be about the Oxfam misconduct in Haiti. So if you're interested in hearing that, at this point, we have several hours of bonus content up on Patreon. So if you're bored in the house and you're in the house bored, check it out.
And if you can't reach us on Patreon, we're also available on Instagram at dascriminalpod.
We recently upgraded our podcast hosting subscription, like the service we pay to put the podcast out to listen to. So now we get a better breakdown of our listening statistics, and we can see that we have fans right now in 27 countries. So that's absolutely amazing.
I just like seeing the map color with various listeners. It's like conquering a map, you know.
Slowly building our empire.
Yeah.
But it is genuinely like so exciting to us that people in Australia or Switzerland or Venezuela are tuning into our podcast. That's so amazing.
Yeah, shout out to our listeners in Algeria and Albania as well. Bahrain, respect, you know.
Yeah, it's just so cool seeing that pop up. So thank you guys. We really appreciate it. Please tell your friends, leave us positive reviews on Apple Podcasts or any service that allows, reviews, ratings, things like that. But really, we just appreciate it so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And until next time. And to our Patreons, of course, we'll see you on Wednesday.
Yep, and for the rest of you, we will see you on Monday.
Bye.
Bye, guys.